What's the wildest piece of music you know? Come to think of it, what's the wildest music humanly possible? Yeah, humanly possible? In this video, I'll show you 25 very different pieces of music, each one highlighting a different side to musical wildness. We'll start at the somewhat wild and end at the insanely wild.
Well, that's wild.
Wildness is a very subjective thing. What felt pretty wild in a 17th century royal court today feels pretty tame. But also what feels wild to you might feel pretty ordinary and polite to me. So we'll try and break it all down, the different types of wildness, the different levels of wildness. And as we go on, ask yourself how much wildness you can take. At what point does it stop being fun and exciting and instead just become this?
The wildest piece of music I know is called Frieza Night by the Books.
Cold Frieza Night.
Okay, so to be wild in music as in life is not just to be crazy and out of control, but also to break free from society's conventions and expectations. You can be fun and wild, or dangerously wild. You can be wild and brooding, or wild and manic. We're basically talking about pieces that break the rules. But what are the rules of music? Should we break them just for a moment? Can you have a whole piece that breaks the rules all the time? Or is that just a new kind of rule in itself? So before we start, pause the video and write in the comments what is the wildest piece of music you know.
The wildest piece of music I know is Josh Wink, Higher State of Consciousness.
Our first example is from a genre you might expect to steer clear of wildness, but actually features quite a lot on our chart. It's classical music. And yes, a few hundred years ago, when music was mostly written for the churches and royal courts of Europe, wildness wasn't very much in demand. Your main task was to please the ear of the king or the cardinal. And if you stepped out of line too much there, then... The only place you'd be likely to hear completely raucous, off-the-wall sounds in Mozart's day would be in the form of jokes or intentionally unpleasant depictions of chaos. Here's Wolfgang's own musical joke, with one of the first examples of multiple keys at once, or polytonality as it became known. A really wild scrunch chord of an ending. Far more polytonal, though, is an earlier depiction of a rowdy pub by the 17th century composer Heinrich Bieber. Yeah, no relation. Drunken soldiers are depicted singing their favourite songs simultaneously in 7 different keys at once. The score is marked in Latin with a phrase that means, "Here it is dissonant everywhere, for the drunk are accustomed to bellowing out different songs." But these are rare exceptions, and notice they don't take the concept of wildness at all seriously. It's just there to be chuckled at and nothing more.
The wildest piece of music I know is Danse Sauvage, The Wildness Dance by Liturgy.
In the Romantic era, classical composers started to get more of a taste for emotional excesses, so there was more room for genuine wildness and extremes of mood. Chopin's first ballade, written when he was just 21, is a good example of the wild style known as Sturm und Drang, or storm and stress, where waves of passion burst through in the music and threaten to overwhelm the listener. So if the norms of musical behaviour are represented by this nice white picket fence, this music is bursting out simply by virtue of its unruly passion and energy. By today's standards, perhaps it's not so outrageous, but at the time it would have felt pretty wild. In fact, we could expand this to include the energy of virtuosity in general. Playing something ludicrously fast and virtuosic can create a sense of comic wildness, like this hilariously brilliant cowbell duet from the Spike Jones show. Comedy comes from how unexpected it is to be able to play cowbells so fast, and the sense that it must be right on the edge of falling apart. But even if they're not funny, extremes of virtuosity can still be a lot of fun. Pieces and performances that push the expected boundaries of speed, like this version of the Tiger Rag, which recreates Art Tatum's famous solo, creates the same sort of buzz as a wild ride at a funfair. In fact, there are actually two kinds of wildness at play here. The wild virtuosity of the performer, but also that of the composition itself. But put a pin in that thought and we'll come back to it in a minute.
The wildest piece of music I know? Powerhouse by Raymond Scott.
As well as wild and intense textures, composers started experimenting with wilder harmonies. So here in Sibelius' Fifth Symphony, for example, the famous Swan theme returns on the trumpets and initially uses fairly straightforward, safe and pleasing harmonies. But it's not long before these veer off into uncharted territory. It's a reminder that wildness doesn't always have to be helter-skelter fast. Sometimes it can be dark, brooding and menacing, like a giant storm brewing. Both Sibelius and Chopin are using wildness as a form of personal expression, and we can see a similar approach in a lot of jazz. In this improvisation over Pachelbel's famous canon, transcribed by George Collier, jazz pianist Hiromi Uehara starts out playing on safe ground, staying firmly within the key and using elements of the original melody. But in the culmination of the solo, she starts playing these giant cluster chords. It's an expression of her wild, liberated self. She's breaking free, she doesn't care. Or, as George Collier amusingly puts it, gradually add more wrong notes, aka jazz.
The wildest piece of music I know is Suspended Animation by Fantomas.
So harmony, and in particular breaking free from the harmonic rules you've established, is one more way to break out of our civilised picket fence of music. Another is sounds, finding unconventional sounds and unusual ways to play the instrument. If you're Niccolo Paganini playing your violin concerto, you can add in tricks like plucks, slides and harmonics that give a sense of the wildness of the soloist, especially when compared to a rather more level-headed orchestra behind them. If you're a baritone saxophonist like Leo P from the band Too Many Zoos, you can add in growls, squeaks and bends, as well as notes that are way outside the traditional range of the instrument, and you can distort the pitches to become sounds much closer to noise. It also helps if you add in a little wild dancing. One of the most iconic instruments to use distortions of sound for wild purposes is of course the electric guitar, and one of the electric guitar's most iconic moments was of course Jimi Hendrix's performance of the US national anthem at Woodstock in 1969. A sense of musical wildness is expressed through the distortion of the familiar tune, and all those uses of bends, moans, screams, pedal distortion and feedback to create a feeling of bursting out of the conventional realms of music. As Brian Eno put it, distortion is a way of making the medium fail, thus giving the impression that what you're doing is bursting out of the material. I'm too big for this medium.
The wildest piece of music I know is the cadenza in the Devil's Trill Sonata by Tartini, but the Chrysler arrangement.
And then there are the ways of creating unconventional sounds that involve larger numbers of instruments. Dixieland Jazz is one of the first places you find a number of soloists creating a sense of wild abandon by all soloing away independently from one another. Although they do all stick to the same key, they each solo as if lost in their own musical world, oblivious to what's going on around them. It gives off a sense of a wild party full of colourful characters. Orchestral composers realised the same thing and soon used their larger collection of instruments to create some truly wild cacophonies. Some still used it for comic purposes, like here in Ryan Latimer's fabulously bonkers Antiarchy. Latimer's overlapping textures and mad sounds resemble cartoon music, but others were more serious. The American composer Charles Ives wrote music that piles up one kind of music on top of another, like here in his Fourth Symphony. It's a similar idea to Heinrich Bieber's drunken bar singers, only this time it's not a joke. It's a genuine attempt to explore what happens when multiple musics play at the same time. One thing that classical music starts to highlight is that wildness isn't just about the performer. You can also get a sense of compositional wildness, a wildness of thought, not just of performance. Ives is a perfect example of that. It's not a wild ride because the players are doing something particularly extraordinary. It's wild because the thoughts behind the music are extraordinary. Connell and Nancarrow's player piano pieces don't even have a performer, and they certainly still sound wild. I suppose you could argue that this is a kind of mechanical virtuosity, but I feel like the real sense of busting out of that picket fence here comes from that feeling that it's hard to imagine someone actually thought this stuff up.
The wildest piece of music I know is I Need Help Immediately by 100 Gags.
Now at this point I'm expecting some of you will be holding up your too much wildness paddles. You know, you can tolerate a few moments of wildness, but a whole crazy piece takes it a bit far. The music most of us are surrounded by every day, contemporary pop music, has almost no wildness in it at all. Probably because the producers keep a close eye on the statistics and they know people will switch off. When you think about it, radio-friendly pop music has a level of control and restraint to match the courts of 18th century Europe. But this music, and I think most of the rest of the examples we'll look at, are aiming for something else. They're aiming for a sense of transcendence. This music isn't something you just put on in the background to cheer you up. It's intended to transport you, not just over that picket fence, but into another realm, a spiritual musical journey of some kind, beyond yourself. It's something that you see music used for a lot in non-Western cultures. In taiko drumming from Japan, there's a huge level of commitment from the performers, who push themselves to physical extremes, and seem as a result to reach their own state of ecstatic, wild transcendence. The intensity is heightened by the extreme limitation, focusing in on one sound over and over. And this stubborn insistence is another way we could say music breaks out of the boundaries of what's conventionally acceptable. In Norway, the fanatulin, or devil's dance, is played on the hardanger fiddle. The instrument has sympathetic strings below the main strings that resonate and give the music a mystical intensity. Performances have a hypnotic quality, and performers themselves are often said to fall into a kind of trance, and emerge from performances feeling exhausted with no memory of having played.
The wildest piece of music I know is Hits by Henry Solomon featuring Lewis Cole.
such approaches started to show up in Western music. There's the quiet rebelliousness of Morton Feldman, whose musical timeframes that last way longer than most listeners are used to still feel quite transgressive today. Or the intense rhythmic repetitions of Louis Andreissen's Workers' Union, written for any loud-sounding group of instruments. All players play in rhythmic unison throughout, which can be both uncompromising and ferocious, but after a while it can lift you off into a sort of hypnotic state. To give you a slightly more approachable version of the same stubborn insistence, try this movement from Messiaen's Tarangalila Symphony, which starts out fun but quickly becomes borderline deranged after 6 or 7 minutes like this, leaving you in a quite exhausted heap. It has this peculiar feeling of being almost embarrassing to enjoy, because to do so is to resign yourself to its pretty ridiculous, over-the-top happiness. Now, I mentioned at the start that wildness is subjective and felt differently in different cultures and at different times in history. But throughout the 20th century, as the borders of cultural norms and acceptability were being probed and tested around the world, most genres of music found artists trying to push wildness to the max, and this mostly involved pushing to greater levels of intensity in all aspects, greater speeds, more volume, more actual noise. You can see this in jazz, for example, with the development first of the manic energy of bebop, and then to the free jazz of performers like Derek Bailey here, a style of music that seems to have almost no rules at all. But the progression is perhaps even clearer in rock music. If we go through the decades, starting with the Rolling Stones in the 1960s, moving on to Black Sabbath and then Motorhead, the guitars get more distorted, the drums get faster, the vocals get harsher. And then we keep going into the 80s and 90s with Slayer and then Cannibal Corpse. We add blast beat drumming, more distortion, more harshness, and we reach a point where everything has hit its limit. The music has moved from something you dance and sing along to into a wild barrage of sound that you just give up your ears and body to. Where could musical wildness go from here? Can anything get wilder than this? And is this in fact truly wild? There's definitely a difference between intensity and wildness. Cannibal Corpse might be peak intensity, but this new rule that everything has to now be maxed out means that to break the rules, to be truly wild now, you'd need to do something genuinely unexpected. Our top 4 contains examples of this new breed of musical wildness, and generally speaking it's a pretty weird place to be.
The wildest piece I know is an ancient Greek dance called Pyrrhic dance.
Firstly, we could talk about what I'll call composed hyper-wildness. I'm going to pick Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask replica for our example, but many works by Frank Zappa would work just as well.
Wild Ives! Wild Ives!
These pieces have what you might call a weird intricacy, another form of compositional virtuosity, where Charles Ives seemed to layer his music up with a sense of joy in randomness and chaos. A piece like this seems weirdly specific in its arrangement. This particular weird line has been composed specifically over the top of that particular weird line. There's a great mystery to the music's purpose. It moves beyond the picket fence by virtue of it being so inexplicable. Then similarly, but from the opposite angle, you could create something so bad that it becomes interesting. I think the Shags fall into this category, a singularly untalented band of 3 sisters who were forced into recording an album by their father. who believed he was fulfilling a prophecy from his own mother.
Time for fun, not for just one, but for everyone.
Like Captain Beefheart, this music has a mystery to its creation. I can't imagine how it was created. It manages to sound strangely together and whole, despite the fact that its performers seem to be standing on 3 different planets. It's so out of the ordinary, you can only call it accidentally wild. Now, in the number 2 slot, I wanted to show how many acts today keep some aspects of that total intensity, but pull back a little on some fronts to cause the wild surprise. I was going to talk about the band Liturgy, who are an extreme metal band who still use fast beats, distorted guitars and screaming, but have turned an intensity that's typically crushing and oppressive into something major key, deliberately ecstatic and positive. So that's their unique twist on Wildness. But then I received this submission from viewer Tony Rod.
The wildest piece I know has to be Konlan Shoujo Sokudanchan by Japanese composer Camellia.
So here's a track with incredibly high levels of intensity, both in speed, complexity, and in the compression, which you can see is really pushed to the max. But then mixing this with the Japanese-style vocal style, which I think is called kawaii, and the sort of Stravinsky and additive rhythms, just makes for a truly disorientating experience that, to me at least, knocks those picket fences right over. And finally, my choice for the number 1 spot... Oh, Dorian, you wanted to say something? Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead. Don't worry, Dorian, we've still got plenty of birdseed. But it's true, we're both really grateful to everyone who supports us on Patreon. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, the number 1. So, my choice for the number 1 spot is really a personal choice. There is no music that's the wildest humanly possible. That depends for each of us on the expectations we have for a piece of music and how far beyond those boundaries the piece seems to have gone. And thanks to everyone who sent in their own wildest piece of music, which I think proved this point. But for me, it's a piece called Panic by my dear and recently departed teacher, Sir Harrison Birtwistle. It's a musical depiction of the Roman god Pan, a wild figure, half goat, half man, who made everyone and everything panic in terrorised stampede wherever he went. The word panic itself is derived from his name. Birtwistle chose to write this piece not just for any random concert, but for the flagship and flag-waving culmination of the great British concert institution known as the Proms. It's one of the most watched classical concerts in the UK, and is pretty traditional, conservative, and maybe even a little jingoistic. Birtwistle threw quite a wild hand grenade into things by writing, specifically for this occasion, a concerto for saxophone and drum kit. 20 minutes of raucous mayhem for both the audience in the room and the millions watching on TV. Although Birtwistle always claimed otherwise, for me it was not just an incredibly wild piece in itself, but it was also, I'm sure, an intentional act of wildness. It caused thousands of complaints and newspaper headlines. The owners of the picket fences were furious. Whatever your views on this piece and on Wildness in general, I for one take some comfort from the fact that people still cared enough to complain. Despite the fact we're all fairly used to wild noises these days, if something is truly wild, it can still have the power to shock us. And I think that deserves a toast. To Wildness and to Harrison Birtwistle, the wild man of British music. Cheers.